California, a state where two of the most infamous steel fortresses still stand tall. At Folsom, 7 members of a violent gang once turned the aging walls into a hidden battlefield. Farther north, Pelican Bay holds 6 ruthless gang leaders who continue to control an empire from inside their cold isolation cells. 13 faces, 2 prisons. One haunting question: who is truly the most feared presence in California? And it all began at Folsom, with the very first name that made the underworld take notice. 1. Sonny Barger, Hell's Angels. Sonny Barger was not born a legend, but fate pushed him down that path. He was born in 1938 in Modesto, California. His childhood was marked by loss. His mother left before his first birthday. His father struggled with alcohol. He was raised by his strict Pentecostal grandmother. A boy without affection, but full of grit. At 16, Sonny did the unthinkable. He lied about his age and joined the army. In the military, he found what he had been searching for: discipline, weapons, and brotherhood. But the joy was short-lived. When his lie was uncovered, he was forced out and sent back to the streets. In Oakland, he bought a used Harley. From that moment on, the wheels carried him into a completely different world. In 1957, Sonny and a small group of friends founded the Oakland chapter of Hell's Angels. The skull and helmet logo that would later become famous? At first, it was nothing more than a design ordered from a local trophy shop. But under Sonny's leadership, the club transformed into the most feared symbol of the most feared symbol of the 1% biker world. He wrote down his rules: no injecting during meetings, no stealing from brothers, and above all, never betray the club. Behind these strict codes, prosecutors later said the Angels profited from illegal narcotics and related enterprises. But money was not the only source of fear. It was the way Sonny handled betrayal. According to testimony, a man who tried to steal his Harley was reportedly subjected to internal sanctions that left lasting consequences. Another member accused of pocketing coin collections reportedly died under coercive circumstances. In Oakland, insiders called it biker justice. Sonny also understood that power was not only about weapons, it was about media. He used newspapers and television as tools. When journalist Hunter S. Thompson approached to write a book, Sonny allowed brief access. Later, he dismissed Thompson as a coward. But the book Hell's Angels turned Sonny into a symbol of American counterculture. He advised biker films in Hollywood. He even claimed that once during a Rolling Stones concert, he used intimidation to compel the band to keep playing. By 1973, the tide began to turn. Sonny was arrested on heroin and weapons charges and sent to Folsom. But prison did not end his influence. He allied with the Mexican Mafia, continued directing Angels' affairs, and even married a beauty queen behind bars. Decisions made in his cell still reached the streets, as if the walls of Folsom did not exist. Released in 1977, Sonny faced a sweeping RICO indictment with 32 other members but walked free. In 1982, cancer of the larynx took his voice. He spoke with a mechanical device, yet every word still commanded respect. He once said with dark humor, "I am not a bad guy, but if anyone wants to try me, I am ready." In 1988, betrayal came from within. A trusted member wore a wire, leading to charges of conspiracy involving explosives. During his trial, hundreds of bikers in leather jackets filled the courthouse pause, and jurors reported threats against their families. Despite the pressure, Sonny received another 3.5 years. From prison, he sent a postcard to the prosecutor that read, "The weather is beautiful. Wish you were here." After his release, his enemies still hunted him. The rival Outlaws gang allegedly placed a $100,000 bounty on his head. The FBI stopped a group of would-be assassins. Yet Sonny survived. In his later years, he settled in Arizona. He wrote books, appeared in films, and even advised the series Sons of Anarchy. In his memoir, he wrote, "Keep your head up high, stay loyal, remain free, and always value honor." Sonny Barger passed away in 2022 at the age of 83. He left behind a legacy of turning a biker club into an empire and himself into a figure both feared and revered. Some called him Maximum Leader, the supreme head of Hell's Angels. 2. George Jackson, Black Guerrilla Family. On August 21, 1971, gunfire erupted in the yard of San Quentin. An inmate rushed out wearing a wig, pulling a 9mm pistol hidden inside. He shouted, "Gentlemen, the dragon has come!" That man was George Jackson, a name that made the California prison system tremble. But to understand how someone convicted for just $71 became the most dangerous symbol behind bars, we need to go back 10 years. George Jackson was born in 1941 in Chicago. His youth was troubled. At 18, he committed an armed robbery at a gas station in Los Angeles. His take was only $71, but his sentence was 1 year to life. In reality, it meant a prison term with no end in sight. Jackson later wrote, "I met Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, Engels, and Mao when I entered prison, and they saved me." In solitary confinement, he absorbed revolutionary ideas and turned them into a weapon of the mind. In 1966, Jackson befriended W.L. Nolan. Together, they planted the seeds of what later became known as the Black Guerrilla Family, part prison gang, part revolutionary movement. Some say Jackson only started a small crew, and the Black Guerrilla Family rose after his death. Some claim he only created the Black Family, and that the BGF took shape after his death, but few deny he was the spirit who carried black radical thought into the cells. On January 13, 1970, the exercise yard at Soledad turned deadly. Guard O.P.G. Miller opened fire, resulting in the deaths of W.L. Nolan and 2 other black inmates. A jury ruled the shooting justified. Another guard, John Mills, was later found deceased after a severe incident inside the facility. George Jackson, Fleta Drumgo, and John Clutchette were charged. They became known as the Soledad Brothers. Protests erupted outside, and the slogan, "Free the Soledad Brothers," filled the streets. Angela Davis, a scholar and communist activist, joined the defense committee. Jackson and Davis even referred to each other as husband and wife, a relationship that fueled a media storm. Tragedy only deepened. On August 7, 1970, Jackson's younger brother Jonathan, just 17 years old, stormed into a courthouse in Marin County. Armed with guns, he freed 3 inmates and took Judge Harold Haley hostage, demanding George's release. When the group attempted to escape, gunfire broke out. Jonathan was killed instantly. Judge Haley also lost his life. The specific circumstances are omitted here. Angela Davis faced prosecution because the weapons were registered in her name. After nearly 2 years, she was acquitted. But the incident turned George Jackson into a figure both celebrated and demonized. 1 year later, the end came. On August 21, 1971, attorney Stephen Bingham met with Jackson. Shortly afterward, Jackson appeared with a wig and pulled out an Astra 9mm pistol. He declared, "Gentlemen, the dragon has come." A violent clash erupted. 3 guards and 2 inmates lost their lives. Jackson ran toward the fence but was shot and killed in the yard. Officials called it an escape attempt. Writer James Baldwin countered, "No black person believes George Jackson died the way they said he did." Attorney Bingham fled the country for 13 years before returning to the U.S., where a jury acquitted him. To this day, no one truly knows who brought the gun inside. Jackson's death sent shockwaves. The very next day, 700 inmates at Attica went on hunger strike in his honor. Weeks later, the bloody uprising at Attica erupted, with many seeing Jackson's death as the spark. His books, Soledad Brother and Blood in My Eye, became handbooks of prison resistance. Even now, in California, if an inmate is found with Soledad Brother, prison officials may classify them as gang-affiliated. Half a century later, George Jackson's name still evokes fear inside the system. Jackson once wrote, "Prison is the closest thing to death a man can experience while still alive." And yet, in that state, he ignited a movement. Some saw him as a dangerous killer, others as a revolutionary soldier. The truth lies somewhere between. But one thing is certain. From a $71 robbery, George Jackson became an unshakable symbol in American prison history. 3. Joe Pegleg Morgan. Mexican Mafia. Joe Morgan was not born in Mexico. He was the son of Croatian immigrants raised in San Pedro, then hardened in the streets of East Los Angeles. There, he learned Spanish like a native, mastered barrio slang, and blended in so completely that young Chicanos said, "To us, Joe was Mexican. If you called him a white boy, you just signed your death warrant." As a teenager, Joe made headlines. He was involved in the death of a man married to his older lover. He was convicted and sent to San Quentin. In prison, he once impersonated another inmate in a bold escape attempt but was quickly caught. The lesson was clear. True power lay not in muscle, but in intelligence and toughness. In 1961, after an accident cost him his leg, Joe received a prosthetic. He turned it into a strange weapon, hiding a hacksaw blade in its wooden joint. He then led an 11-man escape from Los Angeles County Jail, crawling through utility tunnels. Days later, police found him at a grocery store. It was almost dark comedy, proof that no matter what he tried, prison had its claws in him for life. By the 1960s, Morgan climbed to the top of La M, the Mexican Mafia. He had no Mexican blood, but he had discipline, intellect, and ruthlessness. He imposed a tax on street gangs, secured drug pipelines from Mexico, and even built an alliance with the Aryan Brotherhood, a powerful white supremacist group. To DEA agents, Joe Morgan looked like an old-school mob boss. He spoke little, kept his word, and every decision he made carried the weight of a death sentence. He was not just a distant figure. When someone on the outside refused to pay their share, that person disappeared. A case in Seal Beach became evidence against him when former associate Ramon Mundo Mendoza testified that Morgan gave the order. Based on that testimony, Joe was sentenced to life. But even prison walls could not contain his influence. Inside, he called young followers "mi hijo," my son, then gave his orders. In the early 1990s, Los Angeles was drowning in drive-by shootings. Public outrage grew. Then a command came down: no more drive-bys. Anyone who disobeyed would face consequences. According to multiple sources, it was Joe Morgan who issued that order, and the remarkable happened. The number of shootings dropped, a cold paradox, using fear to impose a kind of peace. Morgan's world was not only violence. He read the poetry of Octavio Paz, he told Aztec myths. He explained the Mexica sun symbol to his men. A man who could order deaths, then speak passionately about culture, became both feared and admired. In 1992, Hollywood touched a nerve. The film American Me was loosely based on La M and portrayed a character resembling Morgan. He was furious. He sued for $500,000, claiming the filmmakers used his likeness without permission. After the film's release, several people connected to the project were murdered. The line between movie and reality vanished. With La M, disrespecting a legend meant paying in blood. Joe Morgan did not die by knife or bullet. After 4 decades of violence, he succumbed to liver cancer at Corcoran Prison in 1993. A quiet end that felt almost unfair, yet it sealed his name as an immortal legend among inmates. Joe "Peg Leg" Morgan proved that power in prison was not about race or heritage. It was about making others believe that your word was law. He was the only outsider who rose to the top of La M, and he held that throne until his final breath. 4. Robert Bebo Sosa, Nuestra Familia, Santa Barbara, California. Some call it Santa Bruta, a paradise of blue waters, but also the birthplace of one of Nuestra Familia's most feared leaders. Inside Folsom's secret files, one name stands out in bold ink: Robert Bebo Sosa, the first elected general. The man who gave Nuestra Familia its military discipline and turned it into a crime machine built like an army. Nuestra Familia first formed in the late 1960s. At the start, it was just a loose crew of northern inmates banding together to protect themselves from the southern-based Mexican Mafia. But under Babo, the NF transformed. He became the first officially elected general, and he did something unheard of. He wrote a constitution, inside prison. That constitution laid out goals, structure, and discipline. What was once a ragtag crew became a paramilitary crime syndicate. Their oath spread from cell to cell. If I lead, follow. If I hesitate, push me. If I fall, avenge me. If I betray, kill me. For NF members, this wasn't just a slogan, it was a way of life, and once you joined, you never went back. Sosa's biggest creation was the 14 bonds, 14 iron rules that every norteño and Nuestra Raza recruit had to obey. No betrayal, no gambling debts, absolute obedience. Break a bond, face the harshest penalties. Court records later described it this way. The 14 bonds are a complete textbook of duties and consequences. In other words, Bebo built a deadly academy right behind the walls. He also locked in their chain of command. At the top, the generals, La Mesa. Beneath them, captains, señores, lieutenants, inmates, and soldiers. On the streets, the norteños became their foot soldiers. Inside, the Nuestra Raza acted like a training school, passing down the rules to every new generation. Many sources say the 14 bonds were first drafted in Folsom's Unit 4A, the cold, solitary wing. Whether true or not, the impact was real. Any norteño who ignored duty on the streets would soon face a severe internal order sent from inside. But power always comes with blood. In the early 1980s, internal conflict shook the NF. Prison intelligence reports claim Sosa was even impeached after clashes with other generals. If true, it only proved how far the NF had evolved, powerful enough to run its own government inside the walls. In 2008, the FBI launched Operation Gator Roll, taking down norteño cliques across California. Reporters once again invoked Sosa's name. He was called the Ghost who started it all because the structure he built allowed Nuestra Familia to survive for decades, from Santa Barbara to San Jose and beyond. His legacy still lingers. In the 2020s, when federal courts sentenced leaders like David D.C. Cervantes, prosecutors said clearly, the group existed only because of the discipline, the Constitution, and the 14 bonds. All of it carried Sosa's fingerprints. To outsiders, Robert Sosa was just another inmate. But to the norteños, he was the general who turned chaos into discipline, who shaped a northern prison crew into an underground army. One former member said, "He turned prison into an academy. And we were the students who had no choice but to graduate." Babo Sosa proved one thing. Ideas can be stronger than knives or guns. A few pages of rules turned Nuestra Familia into the only crew tough enough to stand toe-to-toe with La M. Even today, most norteños on the streets may not know his face, but they still live and die by the 14 bonds. 5. Barry the Baron Mills. Aryan Brotherhood. Atlanta Federal Prison, 1979. Inside a cramped bathroom, a card game embedded in violence. John Sherman Marsloff, a 36-year-old inmate, was attacked and left seriously injured. The man with the knife was Barry Byron Mills, a 31-year-old blonde convict. From that moment, Barry Mills was no longer a nameless prisoner. He became the Baron, future boss of the Aryan Brotherhood. Born in 1948 in California, Mills grew up in violence. By 20, he was serving time for armed robbery. Inside, he absorbed the Brotherhood's one rule: blood in, blood out. Survival meant proving yourself in blood. And with the Atlanta attack, Mills showed he could go further than anyone else. In the 1980s, he joined forces with Tyler the Hulk Bingham. Together, they rebuilt the ABU. It was no longer just a racist gang. It became a power structure. In 1989, at FCI Lompoc, an inmate named Arva Lee Ray was forced into a fatal overdose, then strangled. Court files later described it as a blood-in ritual carried out under Mills' approval. Every killing was a reminder, loyalty or elimination. By the early 90s, the AB reorganized. A 3-man commission replaced the old council. Mills and Bingham sat at the top, giving orders from solitary cells. Their communication was primitive but deadly. Pipes in the wall, coded letters, even childish phrases that carried life or death meaning. "It's a baby boy" meant green light. "It's a baby girl" meant stand down. It sounded like a joke, but each message decided who lived and who didn't. 1997 marked their peak. At USP Lewisburg, 2 black inmates were killed in a prison attack. Prosecutors said the order came directly from Mills, who was locked in Supermax at the time. At trial, they revealed a slip of paper. It read, War with DC Blacks, TD, written in urine. The words only appeared when held over fire. The courtroom fell silent. From a solitary cell in Colorado, Mills had sparked a war nearly 2,000 miles away. In 2002, the U.S. government struck back. A massive RICO indictment named 40 AB members, linking them to 32 murders and murder plots spanning 3 decades. Mills was at the center. The 2006 trial in Santa Ana was a spectacle. Agents reenacted how orders were flushed through pipes, how Mills coded messages with the number 187. The defense even claimed in a dramatic twist that mob boss John Gotti once reached out to the AB for revenge. That claim was never proven, but it shook the courtroom. When the jury debated the death penalty, they deadlocked. The result? Mills and Bingham received 4 life sentences without parole. Yet, even inside the concrete tomb of ADX Florence, his name still carried weight. The Baron ruled through codes, networks, and fear. On July 8, 2018, Barry Mills was found dead in his cell at ADX Florence. It was just 1 day after his 70th birthday. Officials gave no cause of death, only saying there was no foul play. A quiet ending, the opposite of the brutality that defined his life. But his legacy did not fade. The Aryan Brotherhood remains one of the deadliest prison gangs in America, still fueled by the laws of blood that Mills helped shape. One former inmate said, he could sit in a cell for years, but one slip of paper was enough to make hundreds tremble. 6. Luis Huero Buff Flores, Mexican Mafia, 1957. Dewell Vocational Institution, a youth prison in Tracy, California. On a dusty yard, teenage inmates from rival barrios gathered. White fence, the avenues. Clanton 14, Primera Flats. On the streets, they were enemies. But here, a light-haired kid with the nickname Huero Buff made a pitch. Out there, we shoot at each other. In here, if we don't stand together, we'll die one by one. His name was Luis Flores, and on that yard Flores planted the seed of La M, the Mexican Mafia. At the time, Mexican inmates were scattered, often targeted by organized white and black crews. Flores saw it clearly. To survive, they needed unity. His idea was simple but powerful. Take enemies and turn them into allies. Create a gang of gangs that could defend itself and control the prison economy. They chose the symbol M, La M, the 13th letter of the alphabet. Another symbol was La Mano Negra, the black hand, borrowed from the Italian Mafia. But make no mistake, this was an American creation. From day one, Flores set the rule. Blood in, blood out. You joined in blood, and you only left in death. That oath kept everyone loyal. La M quickly controlled every hustle inside DVY. Cigarettes, extra food, contraband substances smuggled in by corrupt staff. Flores and his crew introduced tax. Anyone who wanted to do business on the yard paid a cut. The system made the group more than just survivors. It made them a shadow empire. One inmate later recalled, "The second you saw an IME member on the yard, everything went quiet. No knife needed, just the look in his eyes." From DVY, the model spread through California's prisons. By the early 1960s, La M reached Folsom and San Quentin. Flores' system turned inmates into soldiers and violence into management. Anyone who defied an order often faced swift retaliation. But Flores' biggest move was connecting prison to the streets. Outside, tens of thousands of Sureños belonged to dozens of barrios. Inside, they all had to pay tribute to La M. The tax bought them protection in prison and backing on the streets. The two-way network turned La M into more than a gang. It became a government in the shadows for Southern California's Hispanic community. Flores' innovation was to make La M a shared brand, not just another barrio clique. Every Sureño, from San Diego to Los Angeles, bowed to the M. No constitution, just blood law. No national flag, just one letter. But power brings war. In Northern California, Nuestra Familia rose as a rival. From Soledad to Folsom, the clash between NF and La M turned yards into battlegrounds. And every investigator traced it back to DVY, 1957, and one name: Luis Huero Buff Flores. Little is known about Flores' later life, but his legacy is written in every report. Today, La M ranks among the most dangerous prison gangs in America. Every Sureño on the street still pays tribute, just as Flores designed. One investigator summed it up: the Mexican Mafia wasn't born in Mexico. It was born in California on a dusty yard. And Güero Buff planted the flag. Flores turned enemies into brothers. He turned scattered barrios into an empire. 7. David D.C. Cervantes, Nuestra Familia, Pelican Bay, California. Inside a windowless cell, under a buzzing fluorescent light, an old man writes on a slip of paper. By the time that paper reaches the yard, it could mark someone for serious retaliation. His name is David D.C. Cervantes, General of Nuestra Familia. Nuestra Familia, La M.'s sworn rival, existed to protect norteños, the Northern California gangs. But under Cervantes, it evolved into something else, not just protection, a shadow government. If La M was the gang of gangs, then NF under DC became the Supreme Court of the North. Cervantes started small, as a regimental commander in Kings County, coordinating street regiments. But the turning point came in 2008, when several NF leaders were shipped to ADX Florence. Power at Pelican Bay was left open. Reports said 2 veteran generals, Jose Huerito Gonzalez and James Conejo Perez, were sidelined, and one man emerged as the undisputed leader, David Cervantes. In a silent coup, he became the lone general of NF in California. He wasn't the kind to swing a knife. His power came from the General Advocate's Office, the group that handled discipline. Every complaint, every accusation passed through him. He assigned investigators, reviewed reports, and signed the final orders. A warning might mean nothing more than words, but a signature marked green light could mean death on the yard. One signature, one life. From Pelican Bay, Cervantes and a 7-man general council controlled both prison and streets. Orders moved through coded letters, plumbing pipes, and contraband cell phones. In 2010, local news reported that from the SHU, where inmates weren't supposed to touch the outside world, Cervantes still gave orders using a smuggled phone. The blood trail followed. In 2015, Lorenzo Lencho Guzman lost his life in an attack. That same year, Antonio Sombras Villagrana was targeted. In 2016, John Knockers Musquiz nearly lost his life. By 2019, John Shanks Reyna and Matt Rocha were marked. Court records later traced those hits back to Cervantes and his council. In August 2021, the feds dropped a sweeping RICO indictment. At its core was David D.C. Cervantes. The trial in Oakland stretched 12 weeks in 2024. Prosecutors laid it bare: a structured organization, iron discipline, a 76-year-old general still authorizing violent green light orders. One prosecutor told the jury, "Prison gangs are a blight on the justice system. With contraband phones sold, they run a criminal network that spills onto the streets." On October 2, 2024, the jury returned guilty verdicts for Cervantes and 3 other leaders. In June 2025, the court sentenced him to 120 months in federal prison. The number looked small, but in reality, it was the end. The entire General Council, the 7 men who once ruled from Pelican Bay, had fallen. One former FBI agent put it bluntly, "Dismantling Nuestra Familia took decades, but now the 7 who sat on the council have paid the price." The last image of Cervantes wasn't a blade or a gun. It was an old man in court, listening as the judge read the sentence, yet his legacy echoes. Nuestra Familia, once a band of protectors, became an underground court where a slip of paper could decide who lived and who died. But if Folsom was the birthplace of legends, then Pelican Bay became the place where those legends were buried in darkness. Inside the maximum security isolation unit, 6 gang leaders continued their rule from behind bars, controlling an underground empire. Number 6. Omar Arzate, Mexican Mafia. Some kids grow up with books and classrooms. Others grow up with knives, guns, and alleys filled with danger. Omar Arzate was one of them. He was born in Los Angeles, in a struggling neighborhood where sirens and shouts were part of daily life. His parents could not hold the family together. The first lessons he learned did not come from school, but from the streets. While other children carried notebooks, Omar carried blades and learned to stare people down with menace. As a teenager, he gained attention, not for intelligence, but for his aggression. He acted before he spoke. Once, police caught him pointing a gun at a car to send a warning. That was the first time the Los Angeles Police Department wrote down the name Omar Arzate. With that attitude, it was only a matter of time before he came to the attention of the Mexican Mafia, also known as La M. To understand why he was dangerous, you must understand La M. It is not an ordinary gang. It has been described as an underground government for inmates of Mexican descent. Joining is not easy. One must prove loyalty through violence. Arzate did so early. According to investigators, a fatal attack in a Los Angeles alley was believed to be his first test. From that moment, he was accepted as a member of the Mexican Mafia. He was later convicted of a shooting and kidnapping, receiving nearly 30 years in prison. For many, that would be the end. But for Omar, it was just the beginning. In 2021, he was transferred to Pelican Bay State Prison, California's coldest hell. There, he was no ordinary inmate. Even inside the security housing unit, Arzate managed to communicate, to send orders, and to keep part of La Amy's empire alive. Correctional officers said Omar did not need to shout or make noise. His calm but cold stare was enough to intimidate even the most violent inmates. In prison, reputation travels fast. Whispers spread that he controlled drug flow inside Pelican Bay, and that a single signal from him could spark violence in the yard. On April 21st, 2024, Pelican Bay shook after a large fight. One inmate lost his life from multiple stab wounds. A handmade weapon was later found near the area of Arzate and 3 others. All 4 were placed in isolation for investigation. There was no proof he gave the order, but his name was immediately flagged in official reports. Among inmates, he was known as the silent boss of Pelican Bay. Not loud, not flashy, but every move calculated. Once, a younger inmate refused to pay tax to La Ime. Days later, he was beaten so severely he required hospitalization. No direct evidence tied Arzate, but many saw it as a warning under his shadow. Omar's danger was not only in knives or guns, it was in his ability to manipulate minds. In prison, desperate men are easy to recruit. He exploited that weakness, pulling people into his control. In recent years, his health has declined, yet inmates still viewed him as untouchable. A man once said, "He just sits there in silence. But I know, if he chooses, the entire unit will never be the same again." That is the invisible power Omar held. There is a bitter paradox. Letters he sent home to his family were filled with warmth. He told his son to study, to stay away from the life he chose. Yet days later, he signed a small piece of paper, giving an order for another inmate to be attacked. Between the loving father and the cold enforcer stood a divide that could never be bridged. Today, Omar Arzate remains inside Pelican Bay, serving decades until the end of his life. His presence alone weighs heavily. To the officers, he is a constant threat. To the inmates, he is a shadow of control. And to La M, he is proof that even in a place called hell, power can survive, if someone ruthless enough holds it. But Pelican Bay is not ruled by La M alone. On the opposite side, another gang built its own leaders. If Arzate was the iron fist of the Mexican Mafia, then the next man was the strategic mind of Nuestra Familia. His name was Antonio Guillen, the man who turned silence inside a cell into deadly commands on the outside. Number 5. Antonio Guillen, Nuestra Familia. Antonio Chuco Guillen, a name well known to anyone who has moved through the California prison system. Authorities called him a general. On the streets, the norteños saw him as the man who wrote the law of life and death for their gang. He was not reckless, not the type to swing a blade without thought. Guillen was a cold strategist. When he gave an order, the result was certain. A life would be taken. Guillen grew up in Northern California, a region in constant tension with the South. Young men of Mexican descent in the North refused to bow to the Mexican Mafia. Out of that defiance, Nuestra Familia was born. From an early age, Guillen embraced it. He carried himself like a soldier, disciplined, loyal, and ready to deal with anyone who showed disrespect. By the late 1990s, Guillen had risen to a high rank within NF. He helped coordinate an entire street network. Norteños from San Jose, Salinas, all the way to Stockton, were under his influence. Stories circulated of him ordering eliminations. betrayers disappeared. No one saw him act directly, yet everyone believed his hand was behind it. One former member of NF said, "Inside prison, a single note from Guillen could mean someone outside would not survive the night." In 2008, Guillen was arrested in a major federal operation. Dozens of NF leaders faced charges related to homicide, drug trafficking, and extortion. Many thought his reign had ended, but it had not. Inside Pelican Bay, Guillen did not fade. He became one of the so-called bosses in the shadows, a key figure in what was known as the Short Corridor Collective. Inside Pelican Bay's security housing unit, inmates spend 22 hours a day in isolation. No windows, no direct human contact. Many lose their sanity. But Guillen was different. He turned his cell into a command post. Alongside other leaders, he devised ways to communicate, through plumbing pipes, through letters written in invisible ink, or through visitors carrying coded notes. A scrap of paper could decide who lived and who did not. One of the most shocking moments came in 2012. While California still suffered from deadly conflict between norteños and sureños, Guillen signed a document calling for peace. His signature appeared beside leaders of the Mexican Mafia. The media called it a prison peace treaty. To many, it was a stunning moment, a notorious figure calling for an end to bloodshed. But investigators believed it was pure strategy. Too many lives had been lost. Both sides wanted to preserve soldiers and profits. And once again, Guillen knew how to calculate. That peace did not last. In the years that followed, norteños continued to clash. NF remained tied to multi-million-dollar drug operations. Guillen's name surfaced again and again in police reports. A former investigator said, "Every time a norteño was eliminated on the streets, we wondered, did that order just come from Pelican Bay? From Antonio Guillen himself?" What made Guillen so dangerous was patience. He did not need to scream in the yard with a sharpened blade. He could sit silently in a small cell under fluorescent light, write a few lines, and entire networks of norteños would act. That was true power. Some said Guillen viewed his men differently. He did not see them only as tools. He lectured them on the history of the norteños, the reasons for NF's existence. To many young recruits, listening to him was like hearing a street professor. Ruthless, yet persuasive. He kept their loyalty not only through fear, but also through respect. Despite signing a peace accord, despite taking part in hunger strikes to protest isolation policies, Guillen remained one of the most dangerous men in the system, not because of weapons in his hand, but because of the strategy in his mind. Even with age, he was still considered one of the most influential leaders of Nuestra Familia. Pelican Bay was built to bury power, yet for Guillen, it became a throne of iron. As one man once said, "In Pelican Bay, some men are prisoners, but Guillen, he keeps Pelican Bay itself in his grasp." But Nuestra Familia was not the only force casting shadows there. In another corner of Pelican Bay, another name rose, not only through violence, but through ideology. His name was Ronnie Dewberry. Later, the world would know him as Sitawa Jama, a leader of the Black Guerrilla Family, a man who turned a prison cell into a classroom of revolution and transformed willpower into a weapon against the system. Number 4. Ronnie Dewberry, also known as Sitawa Jama, Black Guerrilla Family. Ronnie Norris Dewberry, a name few would recognize on the outside, but inside Pelican Bay, it was like steel scraping against cell bars. Once you heard it, you never forgot. Later, he changed his name to Sitawa Nantambu Jama, a name that sounded like an African leader. But whether called Dewberry or Jama, the California prison system kept the same note beside his file. Dangerous. Extremely dangerous. He was born in Oakland, raised during the 1970s and 80s, a time when streets burned with drugs, guns, and racial division. He was drawn into that storm as if by fate. In 1980, a court in Alameda County convicted him of homicide. He was sentenced to life, with no parole. Freedom ended, but a new path began. The path that would make him a symbol inside prison. At first, he was placed at Tehachapi, then transferred until he reached Pelican Bay, the coldest hell in California. He was thrown straight into the security housing unit, a white cell, no windows, 23 hours a day in isolation. Many inmates collapsed mentally after a few months. Some harmed themselves just to feel alive. But Jama was different. He endured nearly 30 years in that box, and from inside that concrete coffin, he forced California to change. Records show he played a teaching role inside the Black Guerrilla Family. It sounded like a classroom, but the subject he taught was revolution, ideology against the state, and discipline to forge the next generation. Jama was not just an inmate. He was an underground teacher, turning words into blades, whispers into fire inside the minds of others. In 2011, Pelican Bay erupted in an unusual protest. No knives, no guns, only empty stomachs. Jama and 3 other leaders inside isolation launched a hunger strike. At first, only a few hundred joined, but soon the number spread across the state. 6,600 inmates stopped eating. By 2013, it became the largest hunger strike in American history, with 30,000 inmates involved. From a sealed cell, Jama made the system pay attention. Reporters, lawyers, even the state legislature were forced to ask, what is happening inside Pelican Bay? That was not the only turning point. In August 2012, Jama signed a document alongside Todd Ashker of the Aryan Brotherhood, Arturo Castellanos of the Mexican Mafia, and Antonio Guillen of Nuestra Familia. 4 rival gangs, built on hatred, agreed to call for peace. The press called it a prison peace treaty. To many, it was unthinkable, but it happened, and Sitawa Jama was there. By 2015, a lawsuit reached its conclusion. California was forced to end indefinite solitary confinement. The case was known as Ashker versus Governor. Jama's name was listed as a co-plaintiff. From the shadows, he helped reshape prison policy once thought untouchable. But to correctional staff, Jama was never a hero. The Black Guerrilla Family had long been labeled a political gang, hostile to authority, ready to turn ideology into violence. And Jama was the keeper of that fire. A single lecture from him could inspire another man to pick up a weapon. That was what frightened officials the most. He did not need a blade. He only needed words. In 2019, Sitawa Jama suffered a stroke inside prison. The news spread, and activist groups quickly called for his release. Organizations like Critical Resistance and Uncommon Law pushed his case. Finally, in early 2024, after more than 40 years, Sitawa Jama was released. He returned home, leaving behind a long shadow in the history of American prisons. To California authorities, he was a grave threat. To his supporters, he was a symbol of resistance. The truth is, Sitawa Jama, once a convicted killer from Oakland, had turned himself into a flag of protest, forcing the entire system to change. And in that 2012 peace agreement, his name appeared beside another man, Todd Ashker, a blonde figure, cold as steel, the leader of the Aryan Brotherhood. If Jama spread fear through ideology, Ashker spread terror through knives and violence. Number 3. Todd Ashker, Aryan Brotherhood. He was the man behind one of the most brutal attacks inside prison, turning a small cell into a scene of horror. Yet 3 decades later, the same man sparked a protest where 30,000 inmates across California refused their meals in unison. 2 images that seemed impossible to align, but they belonged to one name, Todd Ashker. He was both a cold enforcer of the Aryan Brotherhood and a leading figure in the fight against indefinite solitary confinement. That contradiction turned Ashker into one of the most powerful shadows ever cast inside Pelican Bay. Todd Ashker was born in 1963, raised in an environment soaked in violence. By the 1980s, he was already tied to serious crimes. But his true turning point came in 1987 at New Folsom Prison. By then, Ashker already had a reputation among white extremists, and then a black inmate became the target. Inside a cramped cell, with a hidden blade in his hand, Ashker struck. Prosecutors later said the inmate was fatally attacked with dozens of knife wounds. Witnesses recalled Ashker barely blinking, stabbing as if it were routine, then watching calmly when it was over. That act sealed his place in the Aryan Brotherhood. Within an organization that demanded proof of violence for entry, the homicide became his ticket. From then on, Ashker carried a life sentence, labeled among California's most dangerous inmates. In 1990, when Pelican Bay State Prison opened, authorities concentrated the most unyielding prisoners there, locking them directly in the security housing unit. Todd Ashker was one of them, a concrete box, 6 by 10 feet, lit 23 hours a day by fluorescent light, no window, no contact, no sound beyond metal clanging. For most, months led to collapse, years to madness. But Ashker survived for decades, and from that isolation, he began a new role as a leading voice in resistance. In 2011, Pelican Bay erupted in a hunger strike. It began with 4 men who had endured solitary for decades. They chose their own bodies as weapons. Ashker was one of them. Alongside Ronnie Dewberry, Arturo Castellanos, and Antonio Guillen, each from rival gangs. They set aside old hostilities and signed a demand. The result? 6,600 inmates across California stopped eating. By 2013, the number had grown to 30,000. It became the largest hunger strike in U.S. prison history. Observers called it the Ashker paradox. A man who once killed without hesitation had become a symbol of human rights inside prison. For Ashker, there was no contradiction. In his eyes, both acts, killing to survive and fighting to resist, came from the same instinct, refusal to submit. One of his most lasting marks was the 2012 agreement to end hostilities. Imagine 4 of California's most notorious gangs: Aryan Brotherhood, Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, and Black Guerrilla Family. Decades of bloodshed, now ending with signatures on a single sheet of paper. A handwritten agreement inside a freezing cell, but its reach extended to prison yards across the state. For inmates, it felt like a miracle. For authorities, it was a warning. Even in solitary, they could create peace treaties. In 2015, the case Ashker versus Governor ended with victory for inmates. California was forced to abandon the policy of indefinite solitary confinement. Todd Ashker's name appeared in headlines. No longer only a killer, but now a plaintiff challenging the system. To some, it looked like redemption. But for the victim who lost his life back in 1987, there could be no redemption. That paradox is what makes Ashker's name linger. For decades, he lived at the edge of 2 images: Aryan Brotherhood enforcer and prison rights activist. Some saw him as a monster, others as a symbol. But no one denied that Todd Ashker forced the system to change. Years have passed. Todd Ashker remains inside Pelican Bay, his hair turning gray, but his influence never fading. Whenever people recall the historic hunger strikes, his name returns. The man standing on the thin line between violence and resistance, a living paradox, a figure etched into Pelican Bay's history. Ashker proved that even in the deepest darkness of Pelican Bay, one man could shake the entire system, but he was not the only one. In another cell, another figure rose. A Mexican-born boss who continued to command La M as a machine of violence. His name was Arturo Castellanos. Number 2, Arturo Castellanos, Mexican Mafia. In California's underworld, there was one name that never needed to be shouted: Arturo Castellanos, known as Tablas, one of the core leaders of the Mexican Mafia. From a cold prison cell, he directed an empire as if the steel bars had never existed. Castellanos was born and raised in Los Angeles, in neighborhoods where gangs were law, drugs were currency, and brutality was the common language. From a young age, he was drawn into the orbit of street groups tied to Mexican communities. But Castellanos was not just another street criminal. He had a mind for organization, and more importantly, the ruthless edge required to be recognized by the Mexican Mafia. In 1979, in his early 20s, Castellanos was arrested for an armed robbery. Inside prison, instead of fading away, he rose as someone with potential. The veterans of La M, a name feared across California, took notice. Within a few years, Castellanos was officially accepted. With La M, there was no exit. One entered through violence, and the only way out was death. Castellanos embraced that law, climbing step by step to the top. Unlike impulsive recruits, Tablas carried a chilling patience. He knew when to act and when to remain silent. That calm authority gave his commands absolute weight. Inside Pelican Bay, even locked 23 hours a day in solitary, he maintained control. A scrap of paper leaving his cell, a whispered message, could transform into a death sentence. It was said that a single nod from Tablas could set dangerous actions in motion on the outside. More alarming, Castellanos extended his control far beyond prison walls. He maintained pipelines from Pelican Bay to Los Angeles. Street-level Sureños were required to pay taxes to La M, and Tablas was among those at the top collecting the profits. Inside Pelican Bay, he used handwritten notes, known as kites, filled with codes. Once outside, they became orders. Payments demanded, lives erased. Authorities described Castellanos as one of the most notorious living bosses of La M. In 2013, when over 30,000 inmates across California joined the hunger strike against indefinite solitary confinement, his signature appeared on the peace agreement between rival gangs. It shocked many. A Mexican Mafia boss, built on violence and hatred, signing alongside the Aryan Brotherhood and Nuestra Familia. But for Castellanos, it was never about peace.
It was strategy. Fewer stabbings in prison yards meant stronger centralized power for leaders like him. That cold calculation made Tablas far more dangerous than men who only carried blades. He understood that fear lasted longer than any wound. Officers at Pelican Bay admitted they viewed his handwritten notes as dangerous as any weapon. A faint line of ink could carry the weight of a death sentence. The irony was clear. After decades in prison shadows, Castellanos had grown old, his hair gray, his health fading, yet his presence still cast a shadow across the system. On the streets, younger gang members invoked his name to demand money, to enforce obedience. To many, he remained a living symbol of La M, proof that a true boss could run a criminal empire from a freezing, solitary cell. And when speaking of Pelican Bay's most infamous names, one more figure stands out, a white man, cold as ice, who turned the Aryan Brotherhood into one of the most feared killing machines in American prisons. If Castellanos was the silent boss of La M, then Ronald D. Yandel was the man who openly turned a prison cell into the headquarters of a violent empire. Number 1. Ronald D. Yandel, Aryan Brotherhood. In the prison yard, whispers once carried a chilling line. You want to know who really runs Pelican Bay? Look at Ronald D. Yandel, born in 1961 in California. Yandel grew up around knives and violence rather than books. In his 20s, he entered prison with a life sentence for homicide. For a man like Yandel, that was not the end. It was a ticket to the biggest stage of his life, the California prison system. There, he rose to become one of the most notorious leaders of the Aryan Brotherhood. The Aryan Brotherhood, a name that makes even hardened inmates shiver. A white extremist gang that lives by violence. Entry requires brutality. Exit comes only with death. It has been described as an underground nation inside American prisons, where blades and heroin are the only language. Over the years, Ronald Yandel became the top commander of its California branch. What made Yandel dangerous was not just violence. It was his ability to command from the shadows. He did not need a blade in his hand or to shout orders. A smuggled cell phone inside solitary confinement was enough to direct networks of drugs, weapons, and fatal attacks from behind bars. Federal records stated Yandel and his associates trafficked heroin and meth and ordered executions for betrayal. In a case that shocked the system, he was accused of orchestrating the death of Hugo Pinell, a legendary inmate of the Black Guerrilla Family. In August 2015, after 46 years in solitary, Pinell stepped into the yard. Within minutes, he was fatally attacked. Investigators believed Yandel arranged the strike, exchanging Pinell's life as a loyalty test for 2 younger recruits. A cold, calculated act. A reminder that even legends could fall in the cycle of prison violence. The irony was that just 3 years earlier, in 2012, Yandel himself had signed the agreement to end hostilities, along with Todd Ashker of the Aryan Brotherhood, Arturo Castellanos of the Mexican Mafia, and Antonio Guillen of Nuestra Familia. Many hoped it meant peace, a rare light in the darkness, but insiders knew better. It was only a cover. Behind the paper, violence continued. Drugs flowed, orders for death still passed through. Yandel never truly stopped the war. In 2019, the curtain was pulled back. A federal RICO indictment charged Yandel and other members of the Aryan Brotherhood. Prosecutors called him the de facto leader of the organization. Evidence stunned the public. Secret phone calls, coded texts, and orders for killings traced directly to Pelican Bay. One prosecutor described him as a mafia boss behind bars, still running a criminal network from solitary confinement. In 2024, after a lengthy trial, Ronald Yandel was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. Yet even in that moment, he did not bow his head. According to reports, he looked around the courtroom and said, "I'm still standing. You can't take me down." It was not only defiance toward the judge and jury. It was a message to his followers inside and outside prison. Their leader still stood, still regarded as one of the most dangerous figures of the Aryan Brotherhood. The true danger of Yandel was not in wielding a knife himself. It was in not needing to. A glance, a message, even a scrap of paper could become a deadly order in his hands. Officers could seize phones, tighten security, but as one investigator admitted, as long as he breathes inside Pelican Bay, the Aryan Brotherhood breathes with him. Ronald D. Yandel, a name tied to violence, drugs, and underground power. He entered prison as a killer. He became one of the most feared leaders in California prison history. For him, steel bars were never a cage. They were only walls hiding his empire.